then it is approved. That's all the action items we're going to be taking today. Going into the work, our superintendent search. Come on up, Sally Salter. Susan Salter. Oh, Sally gonna get me. And she's with Alabama Association of School Boards, and she will be presenting to community engagement results. And make sure the Pam and Michelle gets a copy. Okay.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all this afternoon. If you'll give me a second to pull up my PowerPoint. All right. What I'd like to do is go through the results of the stakeholder engagement meetings that you commissioned us to do, as well as the online survey. It's at the board's pleasure. You can ask questions as I go through this, or you can...
Okay. Oh, let me clarify something. This is a special call meeting, and there will be no questions from the audience. Only the board members will be asking questions. Okay, thank you.
And I'll take questions from the board as we go through this, or you can save them to the end, whichever is your pleasure. Just as a way of reminder, the board contracted with AASB to conduct a series of engagement meetings with various stakeholder groups, and also to do an online survey that would be open to anyone in the community who wanted to weigh in. The focus of both the engagement meetings and the survey was to try to get at what the community, your teachers, parents, community residents, felt like this board should look for in terms of skills and abilities and experience in your next leader. Also to gauge a little bit about what they thought were the challenges that this next superintendent will have to confront when he or she takes office. I want to stress this is not, as we talked about when we talked about this service originally, this is not a scientific survey. I can't tell you that it's a representative sampling. What it does do is provide this board with a good snapshot of what your active stakeholders believe you should look for and their thoughts on how this search should go forward. The survey data will give you some quantitative information. The engagement meetings, what I will report to you in just a second, is the recurring themes that we heard throughout the day as we conducted these engagement meetings. And they do a couple of things. The engagement meetings allowed people who didn't feel comfortable with the online survey to have a way of participating. It allowed people who would have been fine with the online survey but simply wanted to come and have some conversation about this, and some of them asked questions. And then it allowed some things to bubble up that weren't anticipated in the survey. So we thought that doing the combination of both meetings and the online survey gave you a good way of making sure that the information that you received the information you needed to receive as we go forward. So let me start with the results of the engagement meetings. They were done on October the 20th. It was one day. We had meetings for teachers and support staff. We had 2 meetings for the general public. We had one specifically for parents and other key constituents. We had a meeting for public officials, and one for building and system level administrators, and one for business leaders. You had a total of 106 people who participated. That is not a groundswell, but I will point out that in 2011, when we did this same work for you, you had 44. Oh. And at the in 2011, you had us do a total of 3 meetings, 2 that were by invitation. They were focus groups with key constituents that were from across the community, and 1 that was open to the full general public. We had 1 person show up at that general public meeting in 2011, so the turnout was significantly better this year, although it's still not a large number of residents. We had across the 2 public meetings 23 participants, the parents and key 24 participants, building and system level administrators 23, public officials and business leaders 18, and certified and support staff 18. And as I mentioned, it just allowed us the opportunity to go a little deeper. I will tell you, this day of meetings was reiterated in the survey, except for a couple of things that were not covered by the survey. So what I'd like to do is, in these next few slides, run through the recurrent themes that we heard. What you see on the slide in red are the items that came up over and over again all day. And those were things like excellent communication skills, the ability to recruit and retain experienced staff, a healer, of somebody with the ability to unite the community, and somebody with the ability to reestablish trust with the community. That came through in the survey as well. But we asked them to kind of flesh out this notion of what's a good communicator, and they said things like somebody who's a good listener, somebody who operates in a transparent manner, somebody who encourages input, somebody who is who doesn't rule by fear, who is empathetic, those sorts of things. And then they also said that they thought you ought to look for somebody who is a visionary leader, somebody who has taken the time to become knowledgeable about your consent order and the unitary status efforts, somebody who's good with finance, somebody who's got the ability to balance the needs of students and teachers. This, while not one of the predominant themes of the day across all the meetings, is nonetheless going to come through loud and clear when we get to the survey results about balancing the needs of teachers and students. And that was fleshed out as somebody who is going to really be student-focused, who's intent on serving all your students, somebody who is supportive of teachers, somebody who's willing to make difficult decisions and then stand by them. I will point out after years of doing this that, quite frankly, you hear two diametrically opposing things often on this last point about making difficult decisions. You usually hear people say they want somebody who's going to take input and be responsive to the communities and the stakeholders' needs and wants, but also somebody who can withstand political pressure and stick to the hard decisions even when they're not popular. And we heard some of that in the course of this meeting, or these series of meetings. And finally, they said that you needed to look for somebody who's got really strong relationship building skills. This plays out in the survey in a lot of comments that people made in a couple of questions about somebody who can improve system morale, bring everybody together both inside and outside the system. Your stakeholders also thought it would come through loud and clear, and with experience as an educator, but not somebody with a military background. Next, we asked folks about the challenges facing the superintendent when he or she takes office. And you may remember we did this work with you in the training session that AASB led for you a few weeks ago. And the input was along a similar vein, although there were some differences. The stakeholders said that, again, uniting the community and raising morale, balancing the use of textbooks versus technology. There was a sentiment for eliminating temporary, and we also took that to mean part-time employees in support services. Somebody who could help unite the board as you move forward and help the board understand the needs of your schools. Somebody who will allow time for programs to get well established and folks get adapted to them before additional changes are made or additional programs are added. Somebody that will eliminate mining of student data or reducing of data collection. And this one's a little harder to deal with. I can't tell you it was a groundswell, but it came up on multiple occasions. There was some sentiment for just eliminating the mining of data completely, and others will know we just do way too much testing. And you'll see that again in the comments in the survey about too much testing. There was a sense that there will be pressure on the new superintendent to reduce the number of central office administrators. And I will tell you this next bullet, I struggled with how to word this because it presupposes that this is going on, and I don't mean to imply that, but there was a sense from the people that responded in those meetings that the business community is dictating the curriculum, and that needs to stop. I couldn't come up with a non-pejorative way to say that, but there is that sense among the respondents. There was a belief, again, in these meetings and in the survey, that student discipline needs to be addressed. You see again reducing the amount of testing, and there appears to be a perception that computers are more of a problem than an asset in the instructional program, having to do, I think, with computers not being always fully functional, kids leaving computers at home, the devices at home, those sorts of comments were sort of all distilled under this one comment. Done for 2 weeks in October. The final day was the 21st of October, the day after the engagement meetings, and we always do that so that anybody who intended to give their input at the meetings and then didn't get there has one more day to get their input in. We asked 7 questions plus a demographic question. None of the questions were mandatory. So you have the largest number of respondents to question 1, and then it slowly dribbles off from there. The question that was least answered was the demographics question, which is always the case. People don't like to tell you who they are. It was an anonymous survey. I will tell you again, it was not scientific, as I mentioned before. But we did go in the course of this, and we collected IP addresses, which again, I can't tie an IP address back to an individual, but we do that so that we have some way of determining if in fact there was an effort to game the system. We found what we believe to be 6 people who did that. That's out of what turned out to be 2,119 respondents. 6 people who answered the survey multiple times is not a major problem, but I will tell you we did go through, we compared their answers, their IP addresses, the dates and times they took it, their comments, and where we had 2 identical sets of responses from the same IP address taken back to back, we deleted one. Because we felt like that was, in fact, even down to the capitalization on their comments, they were identical answers. But we had a few more where we thought they were probably the same person taking it multiple times, but there was enough variation in their answers that we did not delete those. I felt it was better to err on the side of making sure you had every possible response than to cut out somebody who might have just happened to have taken it. And what happens is you may very well have a family where mom and dad both took it on the same evening from the same computer and feel very similarly, and I didn't want to be overly zealous in reducing that. So let me tell you about who did respond to the demographics question. As I mentioned, $2,119 people took the survey and answered at least one question, but as I mentioned, they dribble off from there. 281 skipped the demographics question. But what we know about those who answered is that just under 58% were parents of current students in the system. Another 1.6% were parents of kids who are currently being served either in a private school or in a homeschool setting. You had 31% who were employees, which is 571 people. And then you had 8.5% or 175 people who were community members. This was actually asked, as you see on the slide, as 2 different questions. Were they a resident of Huntsville or an annexed area, and were they a business owner? And for the purposes of the slides going forward, we combine that under the heading of community, because it was only 175 people total in those 2 groups. We also, in the slides going forward, have combined the 2 sets of answers from employees, but as you can see, it was with and without children in the system. If the board would like, I can provide you with additional charts that show that broken out. They're not in today's presentation. There are a couple of places where I'll flag where there were some variations, but generally what the employees with children in the system said is mirrored by what the employees with children without children in the system said. All right, so what I'm going to do is break down the answers. There is tremendous consistency across the overall group, the parent group, the community group, and the employee group. I've got the charts in here. I probably won't go into a lot of detail on some of them where they're very similar. But one of the first question that we asked the first two questions gave respondents a very long list of potential types of experience that you might look for in looking for the next leader, and ask them to rate their importance on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being most important or very important. What did they think you needed to be looking for, essentially? And as you can see, you've got the top tier responses, everything on this slide rated between a 4 and a 5. The top items were creating a positive climate for your employees, recruiting and leading a staff that can effectively serve all students, building public confidence, trust, and understanding in the system, and implementing a successful program of student discipline. You see that creating a sound vision and goals and strategic plan also rated highly. There was a second tier, items that still were rated as important, but not quite as important as that previous slide. And here you see the other types of things on the list: developing relationships with your teachers groups, evaluating program effectiveness, increasing the graduation rate, things like leading a tax referendum, working with the court system with the courts and a school system to implement a deseg order, working with the media. Again, these were types of experiences that you might look for and how important your stakeholders thought they were. So when you break it out and look at the parent group specifically, you see very clearly that it's basically the same list. Recruiting and leading an effective staff, a positive environment for your employees. There's very little variation in the first tier of the overall group compared to the parent group. I will note that parents did not rate the item about working in a culturally diverse environment in their top tier. And if you back up, you'll see that's the second item from the bottom on the overall group's top tier. But it was in parent near the top of their second tier. Private and homeschool parents, by the way, had the exact same top tier as the overall parent group. Then when you look at what the employees said, it's essentially the same list. They did rate developing relationships with the employee organization as more important than parents did and more important than the overall group, which rated it about a 4.7. But they rated it, the employees rated it as a 4.7. I mean, they also rated increasing the graduation rate as more important than your parents' group did. And again, employees that had children in the system had this, even though they were a smaller group, they had the same top 5 items, although in a slightly different order. Looking at how your community responded, your community also put recruiting and retaining a quality staff at the top of the list. And that comes up again and again in the community meetings and in the comments that they made later in this survey. They put public confidence and trust and understanding and creating a positive climate for employees at the top of their list, again, pretty much like the large group, the overall group. Next, we asked the group, or all of the respondents, to rate some job experiences that they felt like were most important. And actually, I use the word rate, and it is ranked. And I need to tell you that the survey software asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 6 what's most important, and it had a place for other. Many of your respondents chose, that's not fair, about 40 of your respondents chose to rank more than one thing as number one, and the software did not stop that. So what you see as you look at this is that those percentages on the screen add up to more than 100%. I went back and disaggregated it a variety of ways. It doesn't change what came out on top. It doesn't change what came out second, third, fourth. But I did want you to notice that it comes out to more than 100%, and we are aware of that. You had 174 parents, for example, respond to this question, and in one of the parent groups responded to this question, and 214 of them gave answers as this was the most important thing. So they marked every single item as ranked number one as opposed to ranking, if that makes sense. But looking at the results themselves, what you see is what came through in the community engagement meetings very clearly. Overall, all of your respondents felt strongly that you need to look for someone with experience in education. That came up repeatedly. Someone who has experience at the central office level or superintendent was less valued, but still 4 in 10 thought that it should be a high priority item. And then you see government, military, private sector, nonprofit. There is not a lot of interest in that being a priority for this board as you select your next leader. When you break it down and look at parents, the numbers are virtually identical, or the percentages are virtually identical. Parents also believe you need to look for an educator, possibly someone with administration experience, but there's not a lot of interest in military private sector. Looking at employees, the percentage of your employees, as is typical when we do this work, they felt strongly that you need, or in large numbers felt that you need somebody that understands education and has an education background. And again, looking at the communities, while they ranked the list in the same priority order, fewer thought that it required experience as a classroom teacher. There's a little bit more emphasis on somebody with administrative background. I will also mention that you had, because we have 5 items here and we offered them the ability to rank 6, about 275 people wrote in comments. You have them in your packet. They are, most of them are on point. Some of them were just an opportunity to comment on something else, and that's where they found the place to comment, and they aren't actually relevant to this question. But we did see we saw an unusually large number of people who responded with some sort of comment about special ed. You don't normally see special ed singled out, but it was here. It wasn't a groundswell, but it was a larger number than I've seen in another community. Lots and lots of comments about education experience and not a military background. All right, so shifting then to the next question. We gave respondents a series of statements and asked them to rate whether or not they agreed, were neutral, or disagreed on it, and you see those items here. Specifically, we ask the superintendent should have a doctorate. Yes, neutral, no. The largest group, 63%, were neutral on the topic, and when you look at a master's degree, 3 out of 4 said they should have a master's. That's required in Alabama, but it follows up with what we heard in the community meetings and employee meetings that it didn't require a doctorate in this particular position. Then we ask 2 questions designed to get at, should you hire from inside or outside the system? And again, you see to both of those questions, slightly more than half responded they're neutral on that subject. There's not a groundswell for hiring from within or specifically going outside the system. And then we came back to the question, because of the history here with non-traditional superintendent in the position most recently, we asked the question another way, and again, you see 66% of the overall group disagreed with the notion of getting a non-traditional superintendent. Mm-hmm. So looking then at how parents rated these items, exactly the same. The percentages are slightly different, but it's exactly the same answers. 7 in 10 believe it requires a master's degree. 65% were neutral on whether or not you need to look for a doctorate. There's no groundswell toward going outside or inside the system for your next leader, but there is sentiment that you do not need to look for a non-traditional leader. Employees, slightly stronger on the requiring a master's degree, and almost 8 in 10 who wanted you to look for a traditional applicant. Community, again, same results. So next we asked the most significant challenge facing the system. Again, this was a place where your respondents could respond with other, and you again had about 270 who chose to do so. You have those comments in your packet. Again, many of the comments are restating items that are on this slide, but they said, one person said, I can't choose just one, I need 3, and they listed them. You had a number of people who said this and that from this list, but generally we heard in these comments what we heard in the community groups. Morale was added as an other, trust building, balancing the needs of teachers and students, the issue of textbooks versus going solely digital was mentioned as an issue. Again, it very closely mirrored to what we talked about when we went over the results from the community meeting. But hands down, your overall respondents in every single subgroup said that hiring and retaining effective and experienced teachers was the most significant concern. In the comments, we did see a number of comments that Huntsville City Schools has lost some quality people, and that stemming that flow, if there is a flow, is important, and building a staff that, as was mentioned in an earlier slide, can effectively serve all students. That comes up in these comments. And then you see the other items there. Nothing else came close in terms of the priority items. And I'll flip through the community response, parents and community responses. Again, same percentages virtually, very little difference, and in the same order. So then we gave respondents a set of descriptors that we often hear in community engagement meetings. Look for somebody who's accountable, look for somebody who's a leader, a visionary, somebody who's collaborative. And so we offered them in the survey a definition of each of these terms. I've not included it here, but just to give you an example, we defined accountable as takes responsibility and accepts consequences. Articulate, communicates effectively with others. Collaborative, seeks out relationships, builds strong teams, is inclusive. Comfortable with diversity, can establish and maintain relationships with diverse populations, interacts effectively with people of different cultures. So you get a sense, we defined each of these terms and asked them the importance on a scale of 1 to 5, what was the most important. And you see here at the bottom of this chart, student-focused and a successful educator, again, mirroring what we heard in the community meetings. Those 2 items here are dead heat, and they came up as the biggest group of respondents across all the subgroups, followed by accountable, articulate, and collaborative. And in the overall group, leadership ability. So if you look at what parents said, slightly higher percentages than the overall group said student-focused and a successful educator. But again, accountable, articulate, collaborative, and leadership ability came up as the top items, or the top descriptors. Among your employees, again, same thing. Successful educator was 1 and 2. Among the community, and the rating scale, I apologize, for some reason the rating scale has reset itself here, and it looks like student-focused and educators much higher, but it's the same percentages as you saw in the other groups. It's a little distorted here because of the way it did the rating scale, but it's the same priorities. And then we asked all the respondents to respond to 3 total different statements. The first was Huntsville City Schools is generally headed in the right direction. As you can see, in terms of the group that strongly agreed or agreed, it was 25%, 29% were neutral, and 47% disagreed or strongly disagreed. When you break this down, the pattern holds for the parents group. 27% agreed, 27% were neutral, and 46% disagreed. Now, I will point out, 46% of parents versus 47% of your overall group. There's virtually no difference on that one. Among your employees, 23% agreed, 30% were neutral, and 48% disagreed. And among your community representatives, 21% agreed, 31% were neutral, and 47% disagreed. Again, remarkable consistency across the constituent groups. And is, I know that we have talked to you as we prepared to do this, that the interview questions that you will ask your finalists, and also as you do your deliberations and decide who will be your next leader. But I'd also encourage the board to share the survey results, especially the issues question and this question, with your next leader, so that that can be part of his or her planning going forward. And then we asked the final two statements that we allowed them to respond to with anywhere from strongly agree to strongly disagree. This was the first time we've asked this question. It was suggested by one of your board members, and I thought it was an excellent question. The first one is, the Huntsville City Schools serves all students more effectively today than it did 5 years ago. And again, essentially you see the same responses that you saw on the previous question. 25% of the overall group either agreed or strongly agreed, 25% were neutral, and 51% disagreed. Then asked to react to the quality of the education my child has received in the Huntsville City Schools has improved in the last 5 years. Again, 19% agreed or strongly agreed, 29% were neutral, and 52% disagreed. There is a caveat here in that people who did not identify themselves as parents of current students also responded to this question. So you've got some folks who chose to respond to it who may or may not have had children in your system in the last 5 years. Among your parents, both, again, reminder that this includes parents of current students and a small group, 30 parents of home or private school students. 24% agreed that the system is serving students more effectively than it was 5 years ago. 24% were neutral, and 52% disagreed or strongly disagreed. And again, same sort of percentages when you look at how it impacted their child. 19% agreed or strongly agreed that their child's education had improved. 53% disagreed or strongly disagreed. When you look at employees, same type of percentages. When you look at the community group, again, same type of percentages. So that takes us through at a pretty fast pace. I have given Keith printouts of the PowerPoint that you have for the media, and an electronic copy for you to put on your website. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know I've run through it pretty quick, and it's a lot of information.
Board members, any question? Okay, board members, no questions?
Okay. Well,
Okay.
at that point, then I would just like to reiterate that I hope that this will help the board as you work to choose the questions that you will ask your interviewees, and as you work to choose your next leader, and that the data that will give them some guidance as they begin to formulate, the new superintendent begins to formulate his or her plans for what needs to be addressed when they take
Oh,
office.
I was going to say, Susan, we're still on schedule for the application to be released on the 1st of November?
Yes, we are working on the brochure now. Rena and Keith have been very helpful in providing data. Elisa has provided data and links to a variety of things. We're going to do the brochure slightly differently than we've done in the samples that I provided you when we made our proposal to you, we are going to include links to a variety of pieces of information. You have a treasure trove of information online about this system. Everything from the consent decree to your finances to, videos about things going on in the system. And so it will include some links so that people can learn more, much more depth about the system without having to go hunting for details.
I was going to follow up with some questions. In the focus group, because it doesn't seem to appear here, was it much discussion about the consent order at all?
Not
These
really.
focus groups?
There
Okay.
was some, not particularly positive, but not across all the groups.
And the communicator part or the unifying part, was it like we need a healer or?
Yes, the healer was on that list originally. It probably wasn't, it wasn't in red, I don't believe, but it came up repeatedly all day. And again, to give you a little bit of perspective, when we did this work for you in 2011, I led the focus groups in particular, and there was a strong division in what we heard at those meetings. There was a group that felt like the system needed a healer at the time, somebody that could unite the system, and then there was a group that felt strongly that you needed somebody that could be aggressive and come in and correct some of the problems that had surfaced at that point and really make some significant changes in the system. And among that group, it was said repeatedly, we're going to need a healer, but we have to right the ship first. And I think that what we heard in this round of meetings is consistent with that. The ship's been righted, the finances are in a much different place than they were 5 or 6 years ago. And now there was considerable support for finding somebody with strong people skills that could bring everybody back and get everybody rowing in the same direction and feeling valued and listened to, and like input was not only sought but actually reflected in decisions.
Okay then, Susan.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
Whoa.
Oh wait, I think
Well, I couldn't get in.
Excuse me, we're not adjourned. Mr. Walker McGinnis has discovered he has a question.
Thank you. Sally, just for the general knowledge, we start the 1st of November and we end the application process?
I'm trying to remember what the actual deadline is. It's sometime in December. And
He has to do 30 days.
The timeline that we had proposed would have the new superintendent starting on March 4th.
Okay. And what are you going to be doing right after all the applications have been received?
We will begin before the application deadline, screening the people who have, who fill out applications early in the process. But then once it closes, we begin to vet them in some detail. We do not run the kind of criminal background check that a school system runs, but we do vet them with people that have worked with them, people that we know that know them. If they're out of state, we vet them with our colleagues at other state school boards associations, with people that they know and refer us to. So we'll spend a lot of time talking to people who know them and how they work. We mentioned this in the initial proposal, but we hadn't really talked about it. One of the things that AASB does is ask all of the applicants to take an online communication style assessment.
Yes.
And we will ask a couple of representatives from the board to fill out what we call a job assessment that gets at the atmosphere in which this position works. Do you need somebody very task focused or very
Susan,
people focused, that sort of thing?
When
And
you
then
come
we'll-
up on November the 2nd,
I beg your pardon?
the second part, November the 2nd, they'll come in and do a one-on-one interview with the new board.
Yes.
So they can get that'll be a good time for you to present to them this job assessment, so then they can tell you one-on-one what they want to be able to make their decision based on.
Absolutely. And all that job assessment does, it's not about tasks, it's about the way the person works.
You're going to choose your own time, Pam. You get to choose your own time at any time that day, and each one you'll be getting an hour with the representative. So
it's
Elisa's
individual.
going to be setting that time up, so you get an email from her.
Yeah, and let me say, for those that were not present when we did the training, the reason we do those one-on-ones is I've been at AASB for 20 years, and I can probably count fewer than 10 superintendents who've lost their jobs over competence issues. It is almost always communication and ability to work with the board and the team surrounding the system, or in the system. And so those one-on-one meetings are designed to allow Dr. Jenkins, our lead consultant, to get to know each of the board members directly and to get a better sense of who could work effectively, because that is a huge part of what we try to do. And that's why I was getting into the discussion about the communication style assessment. That will be part of our decision-making process as well.
Last question, how many candidates are you gonna present?
I think I told them 5 yesterday.
Five.
Yeah.
5 is what we typically present.
5. Top 5. Fabulous 5.
Yes.
And I think the drop dead in the date and in the contract is March 1st.
Yeah, it is for getting the finalists to you and allowing you to do your work, but our timeline calls for us to get the finalists to you well before that.
Way before.
And it anticipates if they start on March 4th, that they would have given a month's notice where they were.
In our last board meeting, we talked about the superintendent finalists and not having that criminal background check. So I believe that we're going to pay for them to have that before they come to us. I don't want to have to knock somebody out after they're in the top 5. I'd rather they already be gone. So just if anyone asks you, we will be asking that of them.
Okay.
But we'll cover the $50 fee.
Okay. And there's some legal issues as to why we do not, but you have the
understand.
ability to do that.
And there are legal issues why we will. So.
Yes. I think it's a very good plan.
Ms. McGinnis. Are we through now?
I'm through.
Ms. Wilder? Okay, now we are adjourned.
She said, "I'll try," and you can see resolve,